Those words are correct because there are other words in the air tonight. One's calling for impeachment. And finally, sadly, those words must be taken seriously. Good night.
Have a nice weekend.
The Tonight Show will not be seen tonight, so that we may bring you the following NBC News special report.
I read in one of the newspapers this morning the headline, Cox Defiant. I do want to say that I don't feel defiant. In fact, I told my wife this morning I hate a fight. Some things I feel very deeply about are at stake, and I hope that I can explain and defend them steadfastly.
Good evening. The country tonight is in the midst of what may be the most serious constitutional crisis in its history. The president has fired the man you just saw, the special Watergate prosecutor, Archibald Cox, and he has sent FBI agents to the office of the special prosecution staff and to the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General, and the President has ordered the FBI to seal off those offices. Because of the President's action, the Attorney General has resigned. Elliot Richardson, who was appointed Attorney General only last May in the midst of the Watergate scandals, has quit, saying he cannot carry out Mr. Nixon's instructions. Richardson's deputy, William Ruckelshaus, has been fired. Ruckelshaus refused, in a moment of constitutional drama, to obey a presidential order to fire the special Watergate prosecutor. The president has abolished Special Watergate prosecutor Cox's office and duties and turned the prosecution of Watergate crimes over to the Justice Department. And the Justice Department is now headed, at the President's direction, by the Solicitor General Robert H. Bork, who has held his office only since last June. Bork issued a terse statement tonight saying, in explanation of his firing of the Special Watergate prosecutor, "All I will say is that I carried out the President's directive." The series of events that precipitated this crisis began at 8:15 o'clock Friday night, when the President announced that he would not obey a court order to surrender the Watergate tapes. Instead, Mr. Nixon said he would make available a summary of recorded White House conversations, which he felt were relevant and which he personally would edit. He would have, the President said, he would have the summary authenticated by Senator John Stennis, who would be allowed to hear the full tapes. At the same time, the President ordered Special Prosecutor Cox to stop his efforts to acquire those tapes. The President acted less than 4 hours before he would have been forced to make one of two choices, either to bow to a Circuit Court of Appeals order to surrender the tapes, or to Federal Judge John Sirica, or to appeal that order to the Supreme Court. Mr. Nixon acted after meeting with the Watergate Committee Chairman, Sam Ervin, and the Vice Chairman, Senator Baker. Both went along with the President's proposal. That was an important consideration. There was one other. Had the President defied the Supreme Court outright, he knew he faced a movement toward impeachment by some members of the House of Representatives. So here is where we stand. The President has offered a compromise designed to circumvent a court order which would have required him to turn over the secret tapes to a federal judge. He has lost his Attorney General in a dramatic resignation. Mr. Nixon then tried to get the Deputy Attorney General to fire the Special Watergate prosecutor, and when the Deputy Attorney General wouldn't do it, he was fired. Then Mr. Nixon got the Solicitor General to do the job and named him the acting head of the Justice Department. And half an hour after the Special Watergate prosecutor had been fired, agents of the FBI, acting at the direction of the White House, sealed off the offices of the Special Prosecutor, the offices of the Attorney General, and the offices of the Deputy Attorney General. That's a stunning development, and nothing even remotely like it has happened in all of our history. All of this adds up to a totally unprecedented situation, a grave and profound crisis in which the President has set himself against his own Attorney General and the Department of Justice. Nothing like this has ever happened before. And what it means is that the worst dreams of everyone who is worried about the President's secret tapes have now become true, become reality. Mr. Nixon has lost Richardson, Ruckelshaus, and has fired Cox. Now we go to Washington, where Douglas Kiker will give us the background on the origins and the functions of Cox's office.
Elliot Richardson was appointed Attorney General last spring by President Nixon after Richard Kleindienst resigned. Richardson was highly regarded on Capitol Hill. He had just been confirmed as Secretary of Defense, but it soon became clear that the Senate would not approve him in his new job unless and until he appointed a special Watergate prosecutor and gave him full independent authority. The man Richardson chose was Archibald Cox, a professor of labor law at Harvard and a former U.S. Solicitor General in the Kennedy administration. On May 21st, both men spoke of the independence Cox would have to pursue the Watergate investigation.
Mr. Cox will have full independence as far as I'm concerned. He has been given, or will be given, upon his appointment, full authority to investigate all aspects of the Watergate case itself and other related matters.
And Mr. Cox, do you feel that you've been given enough authority to be totally independent in pursuing this investigation?
I certainly do. The document speaks of full responsibility. It contains an engagement not to countermand or interfere with any of my activities. It directs other people in the Department of Justice to cooperate. And every conversation that the Secretary and I have had assures me that those words are to be taken literally or more than literally. And I think there's, in addition, inherent in my position.
What if, in Senator Byrd's words, this trail leads into the Oval Office at the White House?
Well, as I replied then, the trail should be followed wherever it leads.
That trail quickly led to what has become known as the Watergate tapes. Once it became known that tapes were made of every conversation inside President Nixon's office, Cox went to court and asked federal Judge John Sirica to order the president to surrender those recordings to him. Judge Sirica ruled that the president must give him, that is, the judge, the recordings for him to review and decide if they should be turned over to Cox. The president and his White House lawyers appealed that decision, claiming executive privilege and declaring that such an action would fly in the face of the doctrine of the separation of powers. But the White House did say that the president would surrender the tapes if the Supreme Court handed down a definitive ruling ordering him to do so. The next step for the president was to appeal to the U.S. Court of Appeals. He did so, and that seven-man court ruled against him. That ruling set in action the events of yesterday and today. The president had until 4 p.m. yesterday afternoon to appeal this latest ruling to the Supreme Court. But last night, the White House announced that Mr. Nixon would neither appeal nor comply with the order. Instead, the president said that he would provide a summary of the tapes to both the court and the Senate Watergate Committee. And as a guarantee of accuracy, the president said he would allow Mississippi Senator John Stennis to listen to the actual tape and compare their contents with the summaries. Both Senator Sam Ervin and Senator Howard Baker agreed to that compromise. The court already had ruled that their committee had no power to subpoena the tape recordings. But Archibald Cox did not agree. Yesterday, Mr. Nixon ordered Cox to stop going to court to try and gain access to the tapes. Today, Cox held a news conference and said, in effect, that since the president was defying the courts, he was going to defy the president. He said he would go back to court and ask the court to make the president obey its ruling and surrender the tapes. Cox said he was not out to get the president, but he said he had decided to stick by what he thought was right. Cox also said it was not just the tapes. He charged that the White House also had constantly hindered him in his Watergate investigation. And he said he would not resign from his job. That is, if he left, it would be because he was fired. After that, everybody was left wondering what would happen next. Earlier tonight, reporters met Deputy Attorney General Williams Ruckelshaus as he left the Justice Department. Here's what happened.
What's your general reaction to the developments today?
Well, there'll be an announcement out of the White House later on. I can't say it.
There will be?
Does it have to do with the resignation of the Attorney General? Well, it might, but you'll have to get it from them. Excuse me.
Thank you, Bill.
Although the Deputy Attorney General didn't have much to say to reporters at that moment, it was evident from his appearance that something big was about to happen in Washington tonight. And indeed, this was the fact. Later tonight, White House reporters were summoned by Press Secretary Ron Ziegler, who told them Attorney General Elliot Richardson had resigned. Deputy Attorney General Ruckelshaus, his successor, was ordered to fire Archibald Cox. He refused, so the president fired him. Ruckelshaus was succeeded by the Solicitor General, Robert Bork, who carried out the president's wishes and fired Cox and his entire staff. Reporters took notes carefully, and then the news caused a sensation in the White House press room and sent reporters scrambling to their telephones. Former Attorney General Richardson appeared calm, even managing a wave to photographers as he was driven to his home tonight. He says he will hold a press conference next week. And from now on, the Watergate investigation will be in the hands of the new acting Attorney General Robert Bork, in this car, the man who fired Archibald Cox. As for Cox, FBI agents surrounded his office tonight, moving in without warning, and sealed the records of the office of the Special Watergate Prosecutor. Cox's chief assistant, Henry Ruth, described what happened at that time.
I was met downstairs in this building by a guard who said, "You're no longer allowed in this building." And I said, "Well, I'm Deputy Special Prosecutor." And the guard said, "Well, you're no longer allowed in this building." And I said, "Well, I have some personal papers here that I would like to take out. And that under the Constitution, I understand I could walk in and do that." And he said, "Well, you can go up to the 9th floor, but they'll stop you." So I came up to the 9th floor, and a representative of the Federal Bureau of Investigation said they had been ordered by the White House to seal off our area and not to let any official papers leave the building. I said, "How about personal papers?" And they said, "Fine." 15 minutes after I was in my office, the FBI representative told me they had just been told that no personal papers could leave the building and that the Office of Special Prosecutor did not exist at all.
And as we have reported to you, according to a spokesman for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, agents of the FBI have also sealed the offices of the former Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, who resigned, and his deputy, William Ruckelshaus, who was fired. In our Washington studio this evening, we have some people to discuss this who've covered this case. You see there Senator Mathias of Maryland on your left, Douglas Kiker, whom you've seen, David Brinkley in the middle, Carl Stern to David's left, and Robert McCormick on the right. And I'd like to put a question to David now. David, what do you think the president was trying to do?
Well, it seems to me, John, it was a huge gamble on his part taken to attempt to get the Watergate controversy out of the courts once and for all and get it from around his neck, where it hangs like the anchor from the Lusitania. And to do that, of course, he had to get rid of Cox, who insists on playing it straight hardball, who insists on following the traditional legal methods. And Cox refused to obey, and so the president had to fire him. He knew, of course, that Richardson would not do it, and neither would Ruckelshaus. In fact, he had to go down to the 3rd level of the Justice Department to find anybody to obey. And he is not accustomed, Mr. Nixon is not accustomed to having people around him who will not do what they're told. And before he did all this, he must have considered the probable reaction in Congress, including the possibility of impeachment. While nobody can be sure, we know, of course, that any impeachment resolution would have to originate in the House. And while nobody can be sure, it does seem that getting the House to vote an impeachment resolution certainly would be difficult and maybe impossible. And Mr. Nixon may even have counted the House and figured he was unlikely to lose and gone ahead and done what he's done, figuring he'd get away with it. Tom Brokaw is at the White House and may have some other view on this. Tom?
That I am in agreement to say we have some recent history to support that. That is the president's tactics of having one large convulsive act followed by a statement saying we're off now to new beginnings. You'll recall that in late August we had the president's news conference on Watergate at San Clemente and an urge to the country to get on to the other business. That was followed by the resignation of Vice President Spiro Agnew and his very rapid replacement, another speech from the president to get on to new beginnings, and I expect that we'll have a speech in very much the same manner next week. Already tonight, White House sources are trying to focus our attention on the president's proposed compromise for the release of those Watergate summaries and trying to divert our attention from these stunning developments here tonight. One White House source said the president's motive was solely to remove the possibility of a constitutional confrontation as quickly and as thoroughly as possible, without addressing himself at that point to the possibility that the president may have an even more grave constitutional crisis on his hands. Curiously, White House sources are referring constantly to last night's approval of the president's compromise plan by Senators Baker and Ervin of the Watergate Committee, and they apparently are not taking into consideration tonight that those senators may have changed their attitude as a result of the removal of Cox, Ruckelshaus, and Richardson. As for some of the other details, Cox now is being characterized here as a man with what is described perhaps as an unconscious partisan attitude during all of this. There is the suggestion that he couldn't possibly be fair. There's also the suggestion that it was a mistake in the first place to appoint him, that you can't give away part of the presidential authority. So for now, White House sources are trying to lay the groundwork for the president's next step, and that probably will come very soon in terms of a statement from him. John?
Thank you, Tom. In terms of what the Congress may do, we're getting various reactions this evening. The House Republican leader, Gerald Ford, the man the president picked to be the next vice president, said that he feels that the compromise the president offered on the tapes was a fair and reasonable one, and that Cox should have accepted it. He said that former Attorney General Richardson was caught in the middle. On the other hand, Congressman John Anderson, who is chairman of the House Republican Conference, called President Nixon's action extremely unwise, and Anderson said it would precipitate a serious effort to impeach President Nixon. Representative Jerome Waldy, a California Democrat, but also a member of the Judiciary Committee, to which an impeachment resolution might be presented in the House, said, "I intend now to seek impeachment. The president is acting most unstably." We've also had other predictable reaction from members of the Senate. I'd like to get in now to some of the personal reactions of some of the people involved in this. And Douglas Kiker is with Senator Mac Mathias of Maryland, a Republican of Maryland, who I'm told, Senator Mathias, you were with Elliot Richardson earlier this evening. Is that right?
I spoke briefly with Mr. Richardson this evening, yes.
Could you tell us, Senator, what's his mood and what did he tell you?
Well, we had really just a brief personal conversation. He's obviously very serious about this. But let me say about this question, which is raised as to whether or not the compromise is a satisfactory one. I think that Elliot Richardson is absolutely right. I sat for days on the bench of the Judiciary Committee as we hammered out the charter of the special prosecutor. And one of the key features of that agreement was the provision that the special prosecutor would have full authority over the question of testing executive privilege in the courts and all evidentiary questions. Now, any attempt to compromise that against his best judgment would clearly violate the arrangements that have been made between the administration, the Judiciary Committee, the courts, and the special prosecutor.
But there had been smoke signals coming up from the White House for weeks now, saying in effect that there was trouble between Mr. Cox and the White House. Today, there were White House officials saying that he was trying to make himself a fourth branch of government. And he himself, Mr. Cox, in his news conference, said that he had had almost no success in getting confidential records and so forth. Didn't you have a sense that there was going to be a blow-up coming? Wasn't there a mood in this town that said that something was going to happen?
Well, obviously, things were getting tighter and more difficult. The travesty of this whole thing is, of course, that Cox and Richardson and Ruckelshaus were the people that were trying to obey the law, trying to enforce the law. And now they're the people that are forced out. And that, I think, is the crux of the new crisis, because this brings squarely into focus, are we going to be a government of law?
Well, you're a personal friend of Mr. Richardson's. How would you describe his position in all this? And again, if you could tell us a little bit, how is he feeling tonight? Here's a man who's quit on principle and, in effect, has precipitated a crisis in our government. How does he feel right now, and how was he caught? Was he caught in the middle? Did he feel himself as such?
Well, I don't know. We didn't discuss it in those terms. I think he has done the honorable thing. I think he feels that he's done the honorable thing. I think he's deeply disappointed that his attempt to bring about a compromise which would avoid a further constitutional crisis, further confusion in the country, was not successful. But I personally can see no regrets that he ought to be having. I think he's done all that any man can do under those circumstances.
Senator, you're a member of the Judiciary Committee, which would have to confirm the next nominee for Attorney General. At the White House tonight, one senior official told me that one fallout that they see of all this is that it's quite likely your committee is not going to confirm anyone for Attorney General in the next 3 years remaining to this administration, on the logic that whoever that person is, he's almost certain to be asked, what would you do if there was a special prosecutor and the president told you to fire him? What would be your estimate on it?
Well, I think that's really one of the minor questions that will be propounded to the next Attorney General designate. The basic philosophy of a new top law officer, whether he really believes in enforcing the law wherever the trail leads, as was said earlier on this program, is really the key to whether or not he's going to be given the trust and confidence and votes of the Judiciary Committee.
Senator, as a Republican member of the Judiciary Committee, when Richardson was confirmed by the Senate, did you regard President Nixon as having been a party to the agreement that the special prosecutor would be free to pursue his investigation without hindrance?
Dave, it never occurred to me that the president hadn't fully agreed to the terms that were being hammered out. Now, these were not secret terms. These were hammered out by the Judiciary Committee in open session over a period, Bob, of several weeks, as I recall. And each article was a matter of public property as it was written. And if the administration had the least objection to any one of them, they could have said so at the time. And it seems to me that silence gave consent, if nothing else. But of course, there was much more than simply silence, because Elliot Richardson was there as the president's nominee. He was trying to work out a difficult confirmation problem, which was something the president obviously wanted done. And he was cloaked with all the authority of one who spoke for the president. And it was on that basis that the Judiciary Committee wrote the charter for the special prosecutor and consequently confirmed Elliot Richardson as Attorney General.
Then, as a committee member, would it be your opinion the president has violated an agreement with the committee?
I would have to say, very sadly, yes, because the committee was a clear understanding, well, on the question of termination, for example. This was something the committee spent a great deal of time on, that the special prosecutor's duties would not be terminated except if he were guilty of some unusual behavior, some really gross abuse of his authority.
I'll read you a statement, Senator, from Edmund Muskie. This is Senator Muskie saying, "I believe that these events are of such gravity and consequence to our form of government that the House of Representatives should consider holding hearings on the impeachment of the president. What the president has done threatens to destroy our system of laws. It smacks of dictatorship. Unless Congress responds, the only way provided in the Constitution for resisting such a usurpation of authority, we endanger our country's future." You go that far? Do you think that now is the time for the House to start considering the possibility of impeachment?
We have an extremely serious question here. The courts have now rendered what is a final decision, because the decision of the Circuit Court was not appealed to the Supreme Court. We're back with Judge Sirica for implementing orders, and I think we're pretty close to the crunch.
Senator, I wonder if, this is John Chancellor in New York, I wonder if I could, because impeachment proceedings have to begin in the House, if we could ask our congressional correspondent, Robert McCormick, to tell us what chances there are there. Bob, as you've heard, and as you know better than I, we've heard some members of the House talking about that this evening. What chances are there that the House might move toward impeachment?
Well, I happened to talk to Senator Hatfield, who, like Senator Mathias, is a Republican who's been a little uncomfortable in his party at times. And he summed it up, it seemed to me, pretty well. He's out in Oregon, and he said, well, to use the language of the cattle country out here, this is going to be like a flash flood sweeping down over the pasture lands. Well, that's a little dramatic. Actually, I think the chances for the House impeaching are probably, at this point, fairly strong, fairly good, because the House moves more impetuously than the Senate does anyhow. It's too early to tell, really. They're all going to be terribly distressed, terribly upset, and awfully impressed with the gravity of the decision they face. But I am inclined to agree with Senator Hatfield that the floodwaters have started. Of course, impeachment is only the equivalent of an indictment. When it gets over to the Senate for trial, that's an entirely different matter. I doubt very much whether the president would be convicted. But even Senator Dole, with whom I talked this evening, just a few moments ago, who used to be Republican national chairman, he just got back from Kansas, and he said, well, impeachment, if Congress is so inclined, is its only recourse for punishment, or words to that effect. So I think it is a very real possibility. Of course, by the time all the members of Congress get back from the Senate's on a 2-week recess and the House is sort of running on one cylinder, by the time they all get back and sit down and think the thing over, they may have had a chance to cool off a little bit. But the temper as of tonight is not one that I would consider reassuring if I were sitting in Mr. Nixon's chair at the moment.
Bob, let me try a couple of propositions with you. One is that the House has not been able to override presidential vetoes. So therefore, people are asking, if they can't get enough votes to override a veto, can they get enough votes to move toward impeachment?
Well, it seems to me the answer to that is there's a big difference between a veto and between the president, in effect, setting a policy in which he says the normal course of justice is just fine, except when it gets too close to me, and then I tell the Attorney General he can't enforce the law, which is the colloquial attitude a good many members of Congress have towards this situation in their preliminary judgment now. There's a huge difference between vetoing a bill involving 8 public health service hospitals and trying to override that veto, and the president sort of setting himself up. I'm speaking in terms of the congressional view of it, the view the congressman might take, of setting himself up as sort of apart from everything else. This is, as you said at the beginning, this is something we've never had before in this country, and I think it's, I don't think it really can be compared with a veto. This is new.
Bob, let me try another question for you with your knowledge of the House. All members of the House have to run for re-election next year. In the wake of Watergate, what kinds of pressures will be on them if the country begins to perceive the problem as you have stated it, that the president is trying to say the law is all right, but not when it applies to me?
Well, we will simply have to wait and see. If the country puts the problem in those terms, I think the pressures are going to be enormous, and I think action is going to be very swift. But the country usually doesn't respond quite that abruptly. And in this instance, I think that members of Congress themselves will, as I said before, drag their feet because it's such a terribly important and distressing decision to have to make.
Well, John Chancellor, I'd like to ask Senator Mathias a question. We tend to forget, was it just last week that the vice president resigned and received a prison sentence? We don't have a vice president. Now, what's this going to do to Gerald Ford's confirmation hearings in the Senate? Going to make it more difficult? Will the Senate really confirm Mr. Ford now until this business gets settled with President Nixon?
I think the honest, candid answer to that is that Jerry Ford's going to be an innocent victim, at least temporarily, of this process. I can't see either house accelerating its action on the confirmation of a vice president because of these events. I think the tendency is going to be to slow down. There was already a philosophy on the Hill that as long as the tape question was up in the air, it raised certain constitutional uncertainties, and that perhaps we shouldn't have a new Nixon-nominated vice president until that was over anyway. And this will, I think, deepen that particular feeling.
Can I try something much more exotic on you, and that is this. The Senate committee, as you know, failed in its bid for the tapes because there is no precise statute, as it turns out, which gives the Senate committee jurisdiction to go into court and sue civilly to obtain such materials. Do you think in light of this anyone would be tempted to rush such a statute through to give the Senate committee jurisdiction just to really find out now what's on those tapes? Such a suit would not be subject at all to presidential interference, at least in its prosecution.
Of course, the statute would be subject to veto. Any bill...
And that would be subject to override.
Which would have to be overridden. So that's a cumbersome process. I think that when you think about what can be done in this situation, you turn to tools that are at hand. The court could, of course, of its own motion, appoint a prosecutor. In these unusual circumstances, I believe that the Congress would have to back up that decision with sufficient funding, because this is, of course, a massive job. And so I believe there would have to be coordination between the Congress and the court, even for a court-appointed prosecutor. But I think that's a more easily available alternative.
In the meantime, who's going to run the country? What I'm asking is, how long can we keep this up?
Well, we've been at it too long already, as you know. It's been a terrible and a tragic time.
Gentlemen, I think it might be valuable at this point in the evening to give the president's position on this. There is a presidential position. He is going to get immense criticism for that position, but as summarized by sources in the White House tonight, here's what they're saying. They're saying that the president, having offered a compromise for the issue of the 9 disputed tapes, actually 10 if you add the tapes the committee wants, the 10 disputed tapes, that the president, having offered a compromise, had no choice in what he did tonight. He is the head of the executive branch. He could not tolerate among men nominated by him to high positions in the Department of Justice that they would not obey his orders. So that sometimes, they say, the president has to take the heat. The president took it tonight. The president understands, it is said, former Attorney General Richardson's position, because he did say things, as we've heard Senator Mathias say here tonight, in his confirmation hearings that limited his action in terms of the special Watergate prosecutor. In terms of Cox, the White House felt that he was in open defiance as a member of the executive branch, that Archibald Cox, thereby an employee of the president, the White House says, others place it differently, was in defiance of his superiors, and so he had to go. In terms of William Ruckelshaus, that was more difficult, but he did refuse a presidential order and therefore automatically had to be fired. The White House says that the compromise the president offered on Friday night, very late in that day, delayed incidentally because they were talking with Senators Ervin and Baker of the Watergate Committee to get their assent to the compromise, and they got that assent, that the compromise was the best thing the president could do. The president said that he wanted to avoid a grave constitutional dispute that would last a long time. The president said he thought he would win in the Supreme Court. That is his belief, not the belief of many others who've observed this case, but he didn't want to drag it out, and so he's done this. And that is about the White House position now. They realize in the White House that they are in the midst of an extremely difficult situation. They realize they're going to get a lot of criticism and that they have set in motion events that no one really can predict the outcome. I wonder if Tom Brokaw, who is at the White House at this moment on the line, to add to that.
Just one thing, John. They're also making clear that they felt they had to act in the manner in which they did because the president also is giving a good deal of attention to those events going on in the Middle East. Secretary of State Kissinger, of course, is in Russia at this time. The war continues, and the president wanted to get back to trying to settle that war as well. That's another official White House position that I just wanted to add to your litany as to why the president acted in the manner that he did tonight.
Thank you, Tom. Coverage on this story, including an interview that we're making with William Ruckelshaus, the Deputy Attorney General, who was fired tonight, after this message.
This is the NBC Television Network.
Fresh lettuce, fresh tomato, bottle dressing, not on my fresh salad. I want my dressing as fresh as my salad. That's why I use good seasons, vinegar and water, Now, Good Season's Italian salad dressing mix. Oil. Now shake. Fresh dressing with fresh-tasting herbs and spices for real Italian flavor. If you want your dressing as fresh as your salad, you want Good Season's Delizioso.
You want to start something? Get Rayovac heavy-duty supercells.
Rayovac has the buyer's guide on the back. Shows you Rayovac C&D size heavy-duty supercells can give you longer life than ordinary batteries. In radios, flashlights, cassettes, and toys.
So if you want to start something, get Rayovac. Get something extra.
A beautiful place to lease or buy a beautiful car. Bob Spreen Cadillac, where the freeways meet in Downey.
KNBC, Los Angeles.
You are watching a special NBC report of another event this year that we never believed would have happened in the history of this republic. The president has accepted the resignation of the Attorney General, Elliot Richardson. He has fired the Deputy Attorney General, William Ruckelshaus. He has fired, through the new acting Attorney General, the Special Watergate Prosecutor, Archibald Cox, and Mr. Nixon has directed that agents of the FBI seal off the offices of the Special Prosecutor, the former Attorney General, and the former Deputy Attorney General, and we've never heard anything like that before. All of this was precipitated, we believe, by the fact that the Special Watergate Prosecutor, Mr. Cox, utterly rejected the terms of a compromise on the secret White House tapes offered by the President on Friday night. Today, Saturday, Mr. Cox held a press conference in which he talked about that, and we're going to show you that. Later, we'll have an interview with Williams Ruckelshaus and with Senator Baker of the Watergate Committee. But now, here is Cox's press conference of today.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry to have had to bring you in on such a lovely day. There were three reasons for asking you to come in today. One, I wanted to give you the background of the events of last night, including some of the relevant papers that led up to them. Second, it seemed to me that having taken a stand that attracted some attention, that I owed it to you and to the public to try and answer as many of your questions as I properly can. There are still some limitations on what a prosecutor can say in public. And third, I thought I wanted to say just a word or two about my personal attitude in this matter. I sort of hoped you would understand it, and it may be too personal, but I'll try. I read in one of the newspapers this morning the headline, Cox Defiant. I do want to say that I don't feel defiant. In fact, I told my wife this morning I hate a fight. Some things I feel very deeply about are at stake, and I hope that I can explain and defend them steadfastly. I'm not looking for a confrontation. I've worried a good deal through my life about the problems of imposing too much strain upon our constitutional institutions, and I'm certainly not out to get the President of the United States. I'm even worried, to put it in colloquial terms, that I'm getting too big for my britches, that what I see as principle could be vanity. I hope not. In the end, I decided that I had to try to stick by what I thought was right. Let me try to tell you what seems to me to be the essence of the current problem. And I'm sorry that this was put together so hastily that it'll be a little long. As you all know, there has been and is evidence, not proof perhaps in some instances, but clearly prima facie evidence of serious wrongdoing on the part of high government officials. Wrongdoing involving an effort to cover up other wrongdoing. It appeared that papers, documents, and recordings of conversations in the White House, including the tapes, would be relevant to getting the truth about those incidents. I'm referring not only to the Watergate incident itself, but to other things involving electronic surveillance, break-ins at a doctor's office, and the like. Two courts have ruled that, with some exclusions, not only the tapes of 9 conversations, but some very important papers, memoranda, and other documents bearing on those conversations are relevant and should be supplied to pursue the investigation. Last night we were told that the court order would not be obeyed, that the papers, memoranda, and documents of that kind would not be provided at all, and that instead of the tapes, a summary of what they show would be provided. I think it is my duty as the special prosecutor, as an officer of the court, and as the representative of the grand jury, to bring to the court's attention what seems to me to be non-compliance with the court's order. If the court should rule that there was satisfactory compliance, then it would be my duty in those same capacities to abide by the court's order. And of course I would, and we would go about our business as best we can. That's what I regard as the basic adherence to our institutions of justice, which should be applied and followed in dealing with these problems. You will say, well, so far as the tapes are concerned, forget legalisms. Isn't this a pretty good practical arrangement? I find 4, to my way of thinking, insuperable difficulties with it. First, when criminal wrongdoing is the subject of investigation, and when one of those subjects is obstruction of justice in the form of a cover-up, then it seems to me it is simply not enough to make a compromise in which the real evidence is available only to 2 or 3 men operating in secrecy, all but one of them, the aides to the men who have been associated with those who are the subject of the investigation. It's not a question of Senator Stennis's integrity. I have no doubt at all of Senator Stennis's personal integrity. But it seems to me that it's the kind of question where it is terribly important to adhere to the established institutions and not to accommodate it by some private arrangement involving, as I say, submitting the evidence ultimately to any one man. My second difficulty is that I will not know, and no one else will know, what standards have been applied in deciding what to exclude from the summary. For example, when I give you the various written proposals and comments that were exchanged, you will find that it is contemplated that there will be omitted references to matters related to the national defense or foreign policy whose disclosure would do real harm. I am very troubled by the lack of precision in those standards. We all know from matters that have been published that the Ellsberg fielding break-in was described as matters affecting the national defense, and that the tapping of William Sapphire's and John Sears telephones was apparently treated as a national security matter. Those certainly raise very serious questions as to whether criminal wrongdoing was not involved, although I must emphasize that I do not prejudge it. I just say they raise serious questions. My third reason for thinking that as a practical matter, I, as a charged with prosecuting violations, could not regard the arrangement as satisfactory, is that it's most unlikely, I don't go beyond that, most unlikely that a summary of the tapes would be admissible in evidence. It would be satisfactory for the purposes of a grand jury, I think, but I'm thinking of the actual conduct of a trial. And if that was all that was available, and I was given to understand that the tapes would never be available under any circumstances, then I would be left without the evidence with which to prosecute people whom I had used the summaries perhaps to indict. Similarly, you have all read of cases in which those who have been charged with wrongdoing have said that they need the tapes in order to make their defenses. Again, it seems to me most unlikely that a summary would be accepted by the defendants or that a court would regard it as sufficient. And that could very well mean that those prosecutions would have to be dropped. In my statement last night, I pointed out that we were on the verge of such a problem in the prosecution of John Mitchell and Maurice Stans in the Vesco case in New York. Since then, there has been some suggestion, I understand by hearsay from the White House, that maybe those tapes would be made available, or a transcript of them. I can't think that the two are unrelated. The other main part of the President's statement last night said that I would be instructed not to use the judicial process in order to obtain tapes, documents, memoranda relating to other presidential conversations. This instructs me not to pursue what would be the normal course of a prosecutor's duty in conducting this kind of investigation. And I think the instructions are inconsistent with pledges that were made to the United States Senate and through the Senate to the American people before I was appointed and before Attorney General Richardson's nomination was confirmed. If you go through the hearings, you will find repeated pledges by both of us that I should have complete independence to decide how to conduct these investigations and prosecutions, and particularly complete independence in determining what evidence to seek. There were also specific references to executive privilege and pledges by me and by the Attorney General that I not only would, in his view, be free to contest, but on my promise to the Senate that I would contest claims of executive privilege where I thought the evidence was material. This was finally summarized in the so-called guidelines and the departmental order put out by the Attorney General. It reads, the Attorney General will not countermand or interfere with the special prosecutor's decisions or actions. The special prosecutor will determine whether and to what extent he will inform or consult with the Attorney General about the conduct of his duties and responsibilities. The special prosecutor will not be removed from his duties for extraordinary improprieties on his part. I do want to emphasize that the giving of instructions in this very important respect isn't important because it interferes with Archie Cox. It's sort of embarrassing to be put in a position to say, well, I don't want the President of the United States to tell me what to do. I was brought up with the greatest respect for every President of the United States. But that isn't what's involved. It's that there's a basic change in the institutional arrangement that was established. There was a widespread feeling that there was need for an investigation conducted by someone wholly outside the administration who believed in the normal processes of the grand jury and the courts, who would follow them and adhere to them, and who wouldn't be subject to instructions that might call him off or impede his work. And the purpose of this was to make it plain that the country would get such an investigation. It happened to be me. But this changes it. And I don't think I could properly go on without making it plain that there had been a change. And indeed, I would have no interest in going on if there really was to be a radical change. But it wouldn't be right to continue with the pretense that we had the old arrangement while it was changed and instructions bearing on enormously important aspects of the duty had been given, and if they can be given once, then of course they can be given in the future. And I'm afraid if I acquiesced in them once in the hopes of avoiding a confrontation, and as I say, I don't like confrontations, then I would find myself saying, well, it isn't worth doing it this time either. So it seemed to me that I ought to make plain what was happening. Now I turn to a bit of background. When the Court of Appeals first handed down its memorandum, now let me go a little bit back of that. The incidents of last night need to be viewed against two things. One is the whole problem of obtaining information for this investigation. And the other is the immediate discussions that took place between me and various representatives of the President. It's my characterization, but all I can say is that my efforts to get information beginning in May have been the subject of repeated frustration. This is a very special investigation in some way. The problem is unique because nearly all the evidence bearing not only on the Watergate incident and the alleged cover-up, but on the activities of the plumbers and other things of that kind, is in the White House papers and files. and unless you have access to those, you're not able to get the normal kind of information that a prosecutor must seek. And written documentary evidence is far more reliable in a situation of this kind than the recollection of any witness, and certainly of interested witnesses. As I say, it seems to me that the record has been pretty much one of frustration, either through delays or refusals to provide things we asked. I haven't made a great point of it. While the legal question was being tested, it seemed to me that it would be right for the President's Counsel to say, well, let's get the law settled on these points, and then we can go on from there. And that it would be unfair of me, while the litigation was pending, to attempt to put public pressure on counsel to the President in these respects. But now, at least as of the moment, there's a question whether we can test the legal question. Let me give you an example. You will recall that the papers of many White House aides, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Krogh, Young, Dean, and others, were taken into custody, and they're in a special room. And many of their papers were taken out of the usual files and put in something special called presidential files. Back in June, early June, if my memory is right, I asked that an inventory be made of those papers. I recognized that some of them might contain information that I shouldn't see, but I thought that if there was to be any thorough investigation, that at least we ought to know what papers were there. I've never gotten it. I was told orally over the telephone a short time ago. I don't mean in connection with the current incidents, but a few weeks ago, that the inventory would not be furnished. There have been other papers that we've sought to get, and while I must say that I've been told I would receive them, the delays have been extraordinary. For example, I asked for all kinds of logs of many principal names in these incidents, and I was promised them back in June. I still haven't got the logs of meetings of the President with such people as Chapin, Colson, Gray, Hunt, Kleindienst, Krogh, LaRue, Liddy, Strawn, or Young. I hope our records are accurate. There are many pending letter requests. And I can't help reading the instruction not to seek subpoenas against that background, even though this instruction, as it's written, refers only to things referring to presidential conversations. And I think I'm entitled to suggest that the thing should be judged against that background. Well, then we come to the immediate incidents, and then I'll be through with this perhaps too long account. You'll remember that the Court of Appeals, after oral argument and before it rendered its decision, suggested that there be an effort to reach a mutually satisfactory accommodation in which the President or his representative and I would agree what parts of the tapes should be made available to the grand jury and what parts should be not. I had conversations chiefly with Fred Bizart, They were conducted under pledge of confidentiality. I do not think I ought to violate that pledge. I do think it's proper to say just one thing. I did submit a fairly carefully drafted 6 or 7 page proposed procedure for resolving these questions. I referred to it again within the last week. I have no objection to giving it out, but I don't feel that I am at liberty to do so in view of the promise that I made. I hope I'm not breaking that promise and even referring to it, but it does seem to me to be an essential part of the background. The end of last week, the Attorney General and I were in touch with each other. We had several candid, frank, and very friendly conversations. Indeed, I want to make it plain that at the end of last week and all through this week, the Attorney General has behaved in a way that makes it just as possible for me to say with as complete sincerity as I said at the Senate Judiciary Committee when we were up at the hearing on his confirmation, that I have admiration, respect, and affection for the Attorney General. And I emphasize that to all of you. The conversations ended in a document headed a proposal. You will see his initials on it, and he knows, in this case, I'm not breaking any promise of confidentiality. He knows